Yeah, I had planned to share a little bit of the findings from our Iraq research, but I'm happy to take Afghanistan questions too, and I'll try and improvise on the spot and weave the two together a bit. So to take Afghanistan first, I mean, yeah, exactly, the Taliban or other non-state armed opposition groups, arguably in control of 40% of the territory, another 20 to 30% contested. Obviously, it's not just the Taliban. Partly, there's multiple Talibans, there's local ones, there's a lot of divisions, some that are more controlled by Pakistan. Anyway, there's huge diversity and there's been increasing fragmentation. So one thing you could ask is which Taliban? There's also the Islamic State, which has emerged in Afghanistan. There's the Haqqani network, which is unclear status right now. So all of these different armed groups has created tremendous pressure, and the discussion right now is not just how did they get in control, but can you kind of reconcile them? So there's yet again discussions about a peace deal, or at least there's talks about talking, which has been the case for a number of years. And I would argue that the challenge, so one challenge of course is how do you bring all of these different actors into the state or in reconciliation with the state if you are actually able to get a peace deal? Do you give the Taliban positions in the army, sort of the demobilization and reintegration discussions that you talked about? What do you do with all of these fighters? But I would argue that an equal challenge for the Afghan government is not just what do you do with all of these opposition actors, but what do you do with your own fragmented and often fighting and at odds pro-government forces. Because as much as there's been this large project of trying to strengthen the Afghan state and increase the state's monopoly on control, which hasn't worked, there's been a sort of demonopolization of authority and equal decentralizing tendencies. So all of the different warlords and forces that were briefly united together in the Bonn Agreement in 2002 and formed the body of the Afghan state, increasingly have been sort of rearming, getting their own militias, some of them deputized as sort of quasi-state local forces, some of them on their own, some of them criminal networks. So a real challenge for the Afghan state is not just how do you get the armed opposition actors under control in any peace talks, but how do you get all of these other strong men and power brokers back under control and acting in the interest of the state. I'll connect that just a little bit, if change tracks, to some of the challenge in Iraq, because while the situation is very different, in some way the challenge is similar, and that is the challenge that's presented by this level of fragmentation and by trying to get all of these different actors under the control of the state, and different strategies and approaches to that. What I think is incredibly important to pay attention to right now, obviously it's been success in pushing out ISIL, but the road that we got to there was by mobilizing a tremendous amount of forces, regional, sub-state, quasi-state, non-state, not only mobilization under the Iraqi forces, which regrouped, obviously Peshmerga forces doing their own mobilization and training to stand against ISIL on its borders, but also a tremendous amount of local forces, and I'm sure my colleague here will talk more about it, but from every sort of range of religion or ethnic groups, so Sunni tribal forces and Shia Turkmen forces and Khaldo-Assyrian forces and Kakai and all of this. And all of these local forces from the communities who either wanted to defend their own communities or sometimes were just following individual political leaders or their own interests, they all emerged in the tens of thousands, but most of them could not stand on their own, and so would tend to affiliate with a larger force or sometimes got backing from other regional actors. The US funded some tribal forces, Turkey provided some support, Iran obviously as well. And so what emerged in this 2014 to 2017 period is this sort of competition for local control, where a lot of the larger forces, so for example, larger Shia PMF groups within the al-Shabi are trying to develop their own local affiliates and proxy forces as a way to extend control. Obviously, in the areas that are controlled by Kurdish forces after they expelled ISIL, they might also have local partners with Sunni forces or with local Kurdish tribal forces or what have you. So you had that sort of outreach, but you also had from the local forces trying to find their own backers or their own supporters and be very opportunistic about that and kind of siding with whomever would advantage them. And as a result of this sort of period of mobilization and this bit of fight for control, what you ended up with was a situation that's much more fragmented, heavy proliferation of a number of groups. It's much more divisive. So a lot of these divisions already existed, but the act of having to choose sides arguably increased those divisions and also created some new ones at a very local level among communities that hadn't been divided. And this sort of choosing sides and competition also created a lot of opportunities for sort of tit-for-tat violence, which would seed future conflicts. So huge repercussions for local rule of law and local stability, and also sort of a larger problem because now that you've connected up these sort of webs of relationships from very local level forces and allegiances up to national actors or regional power brokers, you have sort of interlocking conflict triggers. So things that happen at the local level can quickly escalate up and vice versa. So what we've seen so far as a way to try and deal with this greater fluidity between state and non-state and by this fragmentation, at least on the part of the Iraqi government, is to try and deputize away the problem. So I'll take, for example, the legalization of the al-Shabi as an effort to sort of make what they're doing be in the state's name and control. But I think, quite arguably, this has not increased the control over the al-Shabi. They do continue to follow, each group follows its sort of own interests because there are many different groups and many different interests within that umbrella, building up their own local ties and local support, their own economic sources, whether it's illegal taxation or whether it's their own control of economic opportunities, but having the official cover. So they sort of have their cake and get to eat it too. And I think this doesn't increase the chance that you're going to be able to consolidate state control. If anything, it sort of made them more reluctant to cooperate with demobilization strategies or reintegration in the future. So what I would argue is that going forward, it's not enough to just look at these sort of top-down strategies, that there needs to be a refocus on some of what's happening at this very localized level, to have sort of bottom-up strategies for control and refocusing energy on reconstructing these socio-political spaces. And I'll just end with this. I am wrapping up, don't worry. This is not to say that the top-down is not important, because absolutely you will not get stability in a lot of areas of Nineveh, from the Nineveh Plains to Sinjar, unless there is some agreed vision, if not total peace deal or forward resolution between the KRG and Baghdad on what they agree for that area. And similarly, you won't get stability in areas like Talafar unless you have the concerns or interests of regional power brokers like Turkey or Iran somewhat addressed. So this is not to say top-down is not important, but I think in addition, because of this fragmentation, if you don't also partner that with very local level peace building, local attention to sort of sometimes very technical rule of law or governance strategies, to local fighters and their interests, that you equally will not be able to move forward. So I'll just stop there. I'm sure we can have more of a discussion later about all of these different threads, but I hope I've pulled some Afghanistan and Iraq together.